Hello, I'm Geneva Sum, Director of Communications at the Center for the Transformation of Schools at UCLA. This is Among Us, a podcast that unpacks the often invisibilized experiences of students. Throughout this season, Among Us will illuminate the often unseen experiences of students who are furthest from opportunity. We'll hear how systems and structures, both in and out of school, either present growth opportunities or create barriers for young people to thrive. Young people impacted by these experiences are all around us. These students live, work, study, and play among us, and they deserve our attention. This season, we're doing a deep dive into the foster care system. In 2021, over 200,000 children under 18 entered foster care in the United States. Little kids between the ages of 1 to 5 make up the largest share of children entering care. By comparison, only about a third of these children exited foster care. Less than half of these kids are permanently reunified with their parent or primary caretaker. There are way more going in than coming out. But that's just the system itself. What about how these kids are doing out in the world? In the first 4 years after aging out of foster care, 1 in 5 former foster youth will experience homelessness. By age 17, over half of foster youth will have an encounter with the juvenile legal system. And 1 in 4 foster youth will become involved with the adult criminal legal system within 2 years of leaving foster care. A whopping 90% of foster youth with 5 or more home placements will enter the juvenile justice system. So that just gives you a little bit of a window into the challenges that foster youth face. This season, my colleagues at CTS will be having conversations with a variety of people who play a role in the foster care system. Dr. Tyrone Howard is our co-faculty director and a professor of education here at UCLA.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much, Geneva.
Dr. Joseph Bishop is our co-founder and executive director and our resident education policy geek.
Thanks, Geneva.
Dr. Angela James is our senior project scientist and oversees our research portfolio.
Thank you so much.
Joe, I'm going to start with you. If you could talk a little bit about the transition from the Our Children Can't Wait podcast to us now speaking about foster care and issues surrounding foster care.
So Our Children Can't Wait, Geneva, was an opportunity to talk about a lot of things. How conditions outside of school in our society are impacting young people and families, and how schools are having to address a lot of things, and how policy and the potential policy as a vehicle for equity and justice needs to be reconsidered. This podcast talks about a student population, foster youth among us, that is often misunderstood. The numbers have changed, but 400,000 young people are in the foster system. I think for us, we wanted, thanks to your leadership, to think about like, how do we focus on the student population, which often is impacted by all the conditions that we talked about. Our children can't wait, but on a level that sometimes we don't even understand. So this is an opportunity among us to make a shift, to go from just policy to more a very personalized exploration of who foster youth are, the history of the child welfare system, and what as listeners you can do with some of the leading experts in the country like the Tyrone Howards and the Angela James. So that's a shift. So we're going deep. We went wide, now we're going deep.
All right, Dr. Howard, why does foster care matter? And why are we choosing to talk about this issue now, thinking about we are in 2024, we're in pandemic recovery, we are based in the state of California, et cetera?
Yeah, thank you for that, Geneva. I think there's a big misnomer that tells us that youth who are in foster care are there because they have awful bad parents who abuse them. Well, the reality is this. Approximately 80% of young people who are in foster care are not in the system because of abuse. They're there because of neglect. Now, neglect is one of these amorphous terms that has multiple interpretation and definitions. But one of the things that we see over and over again is that many children are in foster care due to neglect. But when you begin to peel back the layers of what that neglect is, it's oftentimes poverty. So what it means is that we're then taking children away from the foundational aspects of their lives, their families, because of poverty, because parents may not be able to provide food every night for their children, clothing, shelter. So these young people still show up at schools disconnected from family. And I think we need to be much more intentional about saying, why are we continuing to tear apart families when families are so vital to the development of young people?
When we think about who are foster youth,
Good question.
over 100,000 young people are waiting for a permanent home. What does that mean? I mean, can you imagine what that means? If you've had a permanent home, imagine not having a permanent home and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting.
Or going in and out.
That's right.
Going in and
That's
out.
right. Yeah.
And-
Or if you connect the through line to who are the young people who end up unhoused, who end up incarcerated, a large percentage of those young people are in foster care at some point in their lives. Some of our most vulnerable populations, there's a nexus between those different populations. That's why we've got to fix this system, because the pathways forward are not usually very good for those young folks.
Yeah, I think that's a good transition to the issue of intersectionality within the foster care system with other adverse life experiences that a lot of our students experience, unfortunately, like homelessness, involvement in the carceral system, and what's referred to as the foster care to prison pipeline. Dr. James, if you could touch on that a little bit.
Well, one of the things that Dr. Howard mentioned, the through line between all of these is poverty. And so these are the circumstances of poverty. And, rather than support families, we've chosen to put our finger in the hole of the dam and that approach. And so, these are co-occurring and interrelated circumstances associated with poverty.
Can I build on that?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Dr. James? I would add to that the intersection of poverty and racism.
yes.
Because you can't talk about foster care, in my opinion, without talking about the ways that racism and poverty and sexism have an
Absolutely.
impact on children and families. Let me just unpack a little bit of this, because we know nationally, for example, Black youth are about 7% of the population, but they're about 25% of all youth who are in foster care. That's a significant level of disproportionality. And you go to city after city after city, you see those overrepresented rates of Black children who are in foster care and Indigenous children who are at higher numbers in the foster care population than they are in the general population. But then you do a deeper dive, you see that those are families that tend to be poor and tend to be led by single parents who are oftentimes women. So you have to ask, what kind of system are we talking about that continues to tear apart families and really has a profound influence on poor Black and brown women and their children?
Absolutely. The same groups that are over incarcerated
That's right.
are overrepresented
That's
in
right.
foster care.
That's right. That's right.
And then you think about LGBTQ plus.
That's right.
Yes.
Young
That's right.
people who are disproportionately represented as well.
And the way that they intersect can be quite unique. I'll never forget visiting a juvenile facility and encountering young people there who had served their terms, but remained there because there were no placement for them. So the ways that these overlap can be, surprising
Profound.
and heartbreaking, to be honest. That was heartbreaking for me, at least.
And so someone might ask, well, what does this have to do with schools? And I think it has everything to do with schools, because these young people still show up at schools.
Absolutely.
And they're not oftentimes supported. And when you talk about the quote unquote bad kids or the kids who have behavioral challenges, these are the kids we're talking about. And I maintain it's not a matter of these being bad children. These are children who are a byproduct of bad circumstances and bad policies. So for example, one of the things I think we can lift up is, kids have a right to their first school of choice when it comes to foster care. What tends to happen if a child is taken from their parents, they have the right to remain in the school that they were at, but oftentimes that right is not protected. If a child is taken from a parent and they're sent to a foster home 60 miles away, that child is uprooted from home and from school and sent to a different home, a different school, different ecosystem, which makes it very difficult for that young person to have any degree of consistency. So we have to lift up the policies that oftentimes are meant to do help to young people, but in many ways they do harm, and figure out how do we help to rethink and reimagine those policies for our most vulnerable students, because we can't just throw them away.
And each time a child moves schools within the year, they often lose 3 to 6 months of learning. So if you think about foster care youth who often during the course of their foster care experience may have 8 different placements in schools.
Easily.
That's a lot of learning. That's a lot of learning loss.
There's a UCLA study from the Civil Rights Project which highlighted students in the foster system as being the most likely to be suspended out of school. So then, again, this question of like, what is the role of schools and not hurting but supporting young people or understanding their circumstances when they come to school. And so imagine you've moved homes and then you get to school where you're extremely frustrated. You're in a new situation and then the teacher kicks you out.
Right.
New people, new kids,
Everything.
new circumstance.
That's right.
And you've been traumatized,
That's right.
likely,
That's right.
because the circumstances of that transition are traumatizing.
We had a study that we did that was done in the UCLA Pritzker Center that looked at LA County. And we found about 40% of young people who had open cases in DCFS were there because their mothers were subjected to domestic violence.
Wow.
So mom is subject to domestic violence. And because a social worker can come in and say, this is a situation of failure to protect. Now, the child may not have been touched or abused, but because the mom has been told that she has been guilty of failure to protect, you take the child away from the mom or the children away from the mom. And so this is where we have to say, how do we keep families intact? You've got a woman who's a survivor. And to make matters worse, talk about trauma, Dr. James. Now I'm taken away from my home, my mother. And let's be clear, oftentimes siblings are separated in this.
Yeah.
So all my sense of normalcy and connection is completely disrupted because of a system that doesn't recognize the fact that why don't we go after the perpetrator and provide supports for the mother and the children as opposed to taking these children away from the mother who herself is traumatized.
So that child is in the classroom.
That's right.
Devoid of all the social supports that they have been accustomed to. And their behavior is surprising. Your response is to suspend them from school. We have to do better. We absolutely have to do better. And so we're committed to doing the kind of research that uplifts the circumstances, but also the solutions. What are policies and practices that work?
So the Roundtable just laid out why we are focusing on the foster care system. Coming up, we are going to dive into why education matters for foster youth. The Center for the Transformation of Schools partners with the education ecosystem to change school systems through research, practice, and policy to support more equitable educational outcomes for historically underserved students. We'd love to keep the conversation going with you. You can reach us at ctschools@ucla.edu. Among Us is funded by the Stewart Foundation, a family foundation dedicated to improving life outcomes for young people through education.
The question I've been trying to think through is, who is responsible? You mentioned DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, right? But like, who at the end of the day takes responsibility? Is it the school? Is it,
That's a great question, Joe. So look, let's get real now, okay? So there are multiple actors who are responsible. But let's talk about mandated reporting, for example. Let's start there. Now, this is a much larger issue, but I want to start there because I want to come back to schools. And I think why this topic is important for education. So when I was in my teacher education training, we were told you are mandated reporters, meaning that as a mandated reporter, if you see something that you think rises to the level of abuse or neglect, you need to report. Report.
We will prosecute you if you don't.
Right. I remember being told that if you don't report and something happens to a child, you may not only lose your job, lose your credential, but you also may face criminal charges. We were all scared straight. I remember sitting in a room, a first year teacher whoa, did you hear that? We may lose not just our jobs, but our freedom, right? So you hear that on the surface, you say mandated reporters. So now you see the smallest little thing that teachers might see. This child doesn't have a coat on a cold, wet day. Let me call a social worker because that's neglect. I don't think that educators realize the consequences that unfold when you make that call to the department and you have system involvement. So part of what's happening now in LA County is a move away from mandated reporting to mandated supporting. How do we give family supports that child doesn't have a jacket, let's find a way to get that child a jacket. If the family doesn't have food, let's find ways to get that family food. We don't have to tear families apart because, again, we're talking about poverty. Richmond, California, they experimented with doing basic income. Let's give families $1,000, no strings attached, to see how much that would help them to have their basic needs met. It made a huge impact, right? Because families were able to make sure they had diapers for babies, food for their children, rent was paid, lights were still on, all these things that supports that family's needs. So when you say who's responsible, I think it's important to talk to educators that when you make that call, understand what that means.
And it's part of a whole fabric of a punitive approach to people. There's a better way. There's a better way. Instead of punishing people for circumstances that are adverse, supporting people that are in adverse circumstances.
And I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that there aren't some substantial cases that do warrant intervention.
Absolutely.
But overwhelmingly, we see that there are cases there that seemingly don't. And especially when it comes to Black children and Black families. And I think, again, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that there is a history in this country dating back to slavery of tearing apart Black families, of removing parents from children, taking children and selling them away. So there's a history here. You can't talk about the current day system without understanding the history of sort of the carceral logics of tearing apart Black families that still has some remnants even in 2024.
There were millions of families that were separated.
Absolutely.
Millions of families who were never
united again.
Never united again. So that history of separating and destabilizing is real, and it's still happening today in different systems.
Right. That's right. And then to Dr. James's point, you wonder why kids show up at school angry.
Let's count by tens.
Yes.
So one of the things that I think is really special about the work that we do is to better understand how to support teachers in responding in supportive manners.
Absolutely.
Like, what are strategies to work with young people in these circumstances?
Let me ask you a question, Dr. Bishop. One of the pushbacks about foster youth is the fact that we're only talking about 400,000 young people. There are 50 million children in school. So this is such a minute population.
Your question, why?
Yeah.
Why that 400,000?
Why the spotlight on such a small number of young people?
It is our moral obligation. The 400,000 young people who we place in this system deserve our absolute focus and our attention. So there's a moral piece and there's a very practical piece. You talk about the money. If we would invest on the front end, we wouldn't have to create these big systems. So it's a question of, do we invest now or we invest later? And do we invest when young people are incarcerated? Dr. James's point. Or is that $1,000 in Richmond, California going to go a long way? And it seems like it's a pretty easy question to answer of what do we want to do and how do we do it?
That's right.
And let's be real, when we take children away from their families and they become essentially wards of the court and the state, the state's not doing a great job.
That's right.
Their learning is depressed. Their graduation rates are much, much lower. And so we say we're going to take you out of your families and your household because they're not doing a great job, and then we do a worse job.
That's right. Yeah, I appreciate what you said, Dr. Bishop. What's the moral conviction that we have for doing what is right for some of our most vulnerable students? You hit the nail on the head. Prevention matters. You can go to any school right now in this country, and most teachers and or principals can tell you who the students are who need some support. If they pay close attention, this family could use a little bit of assistance. That mother needs a little bit of support with parenting classes. This dad needs to know how to discipline a little bit different. We know who those children and families are. Why aren't we willing to put those dollars on the front end with parental training, teacher training, basic incomes, the kinds of things that would help to stem the tide of families who end up in these systems?
It seems like a no-brainer
Yeah.
when you do the math, but I think we've become very complacent.
There's a ongoing debate now around child welfare about reform versus abolition. There are folks who are saying the system can be fixed. The system is not broken. We need to pull the right levers. We need to enact the right policies. We need to retrain folks on the ground. We need to rethink the hotline, the mandated reporting. There are all these folks who are saying we can fix the system because at the core, the system is right and just, good and fair. There's a growing camp of people who think something very different, that this thing is broke. It's been broke from the get-go. Tear it down. It does far more harm, to Dr. James's point, than it does good. And I think that's an important debate that I think schools need to be a part of, because if you say that it needs to be abolished, schools will be expected to play a big role in that. You know, there's a big, Dr. Bishop knows about this, he's been expert on this, big community schools initiative here in the state of California where billions of dollars are being invested in the development of community schools. And one of the goals is how do you provide those supports in schools, at schools, so that families are supported holistically so that their children can be better. Mm-hmm. And I think every educator should be concerned about foster youth because, like other vulnerable populations, they're the most needy. And we get it right for those students, everybody wins.
So throughout this conversation, we've touched on some topics that CTS as a research center is engaging with some studies looking at. Dr. James, I'd love to hear from you as our director of research for the center, if you could share with us a bit about our foster care research agenda and our engagement with this area of focus a bit more broadly.
Absolutely. You know, one of the exciting things about our center is this, I think, unique focus on historically marginalized students, and also a unique focus and commitment to finding what works, what policies and practices work. So we have 3 projects that I want to, we currently have 3 projects that I'd like to uplift. One is we have a project which looks at school stability. One of the things that we know is that foster care youth often experience school instability. About a third of foster care youth change schools, 2 or more schools in a single school year. And that's compared to 7%, what we observe in the general population. So that's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. Our study, in partnership with the Department of Children and Family Services and the Office of Child Protection and the Los Angeles County Office of Education, really seeks to assess the impact of an initiative to transport youth in foster care to the school of origin and better understand how chronic absences impact their academic performance. So that's a really, really exciting project. There's another project that looks beyond K through 12 and looks at post-secondary educational trajectory. In that project, we look at how campus support programs shape the trajectory of youth who have experienced foster care after, right? So looking at the post-secondary educational trajectory of young people. And perhaps my favorite is our project, which we call YPAR, right? There, we engage students who have experienced foster care to better understand their own obstacles. It is said that those closest to the problem are also closest to the problem solution. And by engaging young people in taking serious their own circumstance, their own knowledge, their own understanding of what has happened, what works for them, and so forth. Mm-hmm. That to me is really, truly embodies the spirit of our center. And so I love that project, probably the best.
Just a clarifying question. Can you share what YPAR stands for?
Youth Participatory Action Research. Thank you for that. I don't know how I forgot it. Youth Participatory Action Research. And so we engage youth in researching their own circumstances.
Thank you. Yes, we in academia love acronyms, and we have to remember that not everybody else knows what we are talking about all the time. So
my apologies.
Is there anything else that anyone would like to say? Any final thoughts?
You know, this issue of abolition versus reform, you know, and so there are ways in which I think, you know, pending revolution, what do we do, right? And so I think that when we think about schools, I think we really need to think more deeply about how schools can operate on behalf of educating students, no matter what the circumstance.
That's
So
right. That's right.
if that system changes or not, we still have an obligation to young people to educate them.
They're
And they
still showing up.
they shouldn't have to show up perfect for us to educate
That's
them.
right. That's right. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So it was in the news recently that a number of states are offering free college for students who've been in the foster system. California, I believe, is the only state in there and how they fund schools that prioritizes foster youth. What we've already talked about together is bigger than funding formulas. It's bigger than free college, right? But I think policymakers and the public likes to feel good, like, oh, we did it. Free college. But like, are you willing to do the other things that we all need to be healthy, thriving adults?
That's right.
If you're in a family that is more stable, you take a lot of things for granted. I think I've learned a lot from our scholars who've been in the foster system. The more stories you hear from this podcast, it's going to be really harder for you to drop this issue. So hopefully you feel inspired to do something and not to accept the dominant narrative of this ballooning government system or these kids who don't care, or these families who aren't trying hard.
And not be so willing to exclude,
That's right.
to cordon off, to banish people that need care.
Right. That's right.
Wherever they
That's
are in
right.
the
That's
system.
right. Or look, I'll say this. All three of us are parents. Imagine someone coming and taking one of your children. No questions asked. The terror, the fear, the anger, the confusion that you'd have, and everything that you'd be doing to try to get your child back. Sometimes we have to put ourselves in the shoes of those who are going through these horrific circumstances. We talk about systems, but sometimes we also need to hear the stories of the parents who say, I've done everything that they've asked me, and I still can't see my children. I still can't get my children back. I still don't know when they're coming back to me. I can't tell my kids I'll see them next week. The kids are in limbo. The kids don't know. Just the thought of it.
And I don't know what they're experiencing, where they're at.
Exactly.
I can't help them.
Yep. And that's one of the worst
It's rough.
things you can feel as a parent is
Absolutely.
to feel that you can't help your children when they're in need.
Even when you can't find them in a public place.
Right.
And everybody's
That
freaking
moment,
out.
that's right.
Where
Oh,
is
heart's
the-
my child.
Where
Right.
is this child?
Right.
That total vulnerable. I mean, it would make anybody lose their senses.
That's right. Good conversation, folks. A lot of work to do.
A lot of work
Yes.
to do.
That's
A lot
why
of
we
work
do
to
it.
Our
do.
work is cut out for us.
Education
Certainly is.
matters. Kids matter. And there's always a possibility that we can do it better.
Yes.
Yep.
I know. I'm
Thank
the
you,
optimist,
Angela.
right? Every
We gotta
day,
have
every
optimism.
day.
I felt like we needed to end on a moment of hopefulness and
I think
that
there
we have
is
the power to
always
change.
a possibility that
Yes.
we can do it better. And I think that young people themselves and listening to the voices of young people have to be a part of how we get to that desired endpoint, for sure.
thank you all so much for being here. It's a pleasure to hear your perspectives.
Thank you, Geneva.
Thank
We're
you.
looking forward to
Thank
hearing you later on the season. And yes, let's do it.
Thanks,
Yes,
Geneva.
it's great to dig in.
Now, I want to be clear that we are by no means trying to say that we, as a research center in a premier university, are the experts on this topic. In fact, we are in a unique position to sit in the learner's seat from those with lived experience and others who are working to serve and support children in care. Our goal is to uplift the voices of historically marginalized and underrepresented folks, including youth and people of color. In this season of Among Us, we'll go on a journey together through the foster care system in the U.S. We'll begin with a deep dive into the inception and history of foster care in the United States. You will hear about school policies and practices that impact foster youth, and how foster care can cause students to be chronically absent or change schools frequently. You will learn how foster students navigate higher education, if they're among the 3% of students who matriculate into a 4-year college. Finally, you'll hear from youth activists who are either advocating for reform of the existing system or complete abolition in favor of reimagining foster care in a new paradigm. Let's do it together. Are you with us? This is Among Us. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Geneva Sum. Among Us is a podcast by the Center for the Transformation of Schools in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Caitlin McAloon is the production coordinator. Elizabeth Wyndham is the supervising producer, and Julia Wyndham is the editor. The senior producer is Jay Woodward. Our theme music is Pillar by Shimmer. For more information about this week's episode, go to transformschools.ucla.edu. You can find all of our links in our show notes. If you have any questions or feedback for us, email us at ctschools@ucla.edu. And please follow, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Among Us is produced by Windhaven Productions and Blue Jay Atlantic.